Israeli forces say they have recovered the bodies of 3 more hostages from Gaza. The 3 have been identified as Yitzhak Gelernte, Amit Buskla, and Shani Luk. Israel says they were murdered by Hamas while trying to escape the Nova Music Festival October 7th. Their bodies were then taken into Gaza. Joining me now is Robert Riggs, a Middle East geopolitical risk consultant. Robert, thank you as always for joining us.
Thanks for having me on this morning.
Let's talk about the remains of 3 hostages have been found. How many can we assume are alive still in Gaza? Is it even possible to guess?
My guess is that there is less than 100 that are alive. And the reason I say that is there's been a few clues issued. For example, several months ago during the negotiations between Israel and Hamas, they were talking about 40 hostages released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. And then over time, they downgraded that to 33. And of course, that was a group that was considered sick, non-combatants, and elderly. But at the same time, Hamas made some statements in the last few months saying that 70 of the hostages were killed by Israeli airstrikes. And when you add all these numbers up, it's not looking good. And the problem is that the ongoing conflict there is the hostages are being used as sort of human shields, probably underground somewhere near the leadership in these tunnel network. And so finding them and getting them alive would require the Israeli army to go into all those tunnels, which I just don't think that they're willing to do yet.
And also, not all of them are being held by Hamas.
Right, and that's the other complicated part of it, is that there's a coalition of armed militant groups fighting Israel, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and some others. And so, they spread them out as quickly as possible when they dragged them into Gaza on October 7th, while the IDF was still trying to secure the wall between the two places and put out and try to stop the militants that were still in Israel proper. And so that critical 48 or 72 hours was when most of these hostages, or the bodies of those that have already deceased, were taken into Gaza and then spread throughout the strip. And this reminds us that the approach of hostage taking as a tactic in warfare is not something that's really easily solved even by a professional army when you're dealing with guerrilla warfare and armed non-state actors like Hamas.
It is a difficult situation, especially with the IDF looking at going further into Rafah. Where would that put the remaining hostages? Is there the possibility that they're in Rafah?
I think that some of them are in Rafah, but the one of the clues that Netanyahu is prioritizing the military conquest of Hamas over the release of the hostages is that the language he's been using regarding the release of the hostages has shifted. In the early part of the war, he was talking about, we will get the release of all of our hostages and bring them home, and we will defeat Hamas definitively. Now he's saying, we will get the release of the hostages alive or deceased. And adding that phrase is a tacit, by Netanyahu, it's kind of a way of kind of setting the stage that a lot of these hostages aren't going to come home alive. It's just going to be their bodies, which is a very grim reality for the families of the hostages who have been demanding for months and months that Netanyahu prioritize stopping the war, even temporarily, to bring them home first and then continue the war. And so it's a big rift within Israeli society between some who are saying, well, the hostages, unfortunately, are casualties of war and we need to defeat Hamas forever, versus those that are saying, why aren't you prioritizing the hostages' lives first?
Now, and before we go, I just want to ask one question. Jenin, that strike in Jenin, any concerns that this may spread now to the West Bank, or is this something that's been ongoing?
Yeah, I think it is a concern that the violence will continue to rise in the West Bank, which had been historically much, much more peaceful. But there are these armed groups that have been active in the West Bank for decades, and they're known, and they're constantly in a struggle with the Israeli army and military forces. So I think that the rise in the violence in the West Bank is definitely connected to the Gaza war, but it might be partially just opportunistic movement on the part of these like Tulkarem brigades and other groups in the West Bank who, really don't agree with the ruling faction in the West Bank per se. They would like to see it be a more Islamist government rather than the government of the Palestinian Authority. So, yeah, it's something to watch. And as long as this war in Gaza continues, I think that you're going to see this problem continue in the West Bank as well.
Okay, Robert, thank you as always for your insight.
Thank you very much. It's always wonderful to speak with you.
Robert Riggs is a Middle East geopolitical risk consultant.